Chapter 9: The Shock of Seeing. Most people do not arrive at deeper self-awareness gradually. They arrive through disruption. Something cracks. Sometimes the disruption is external: the collapse of a relationship, betrayal, illness, failure, humiliation, loss, exile, disillusionment, or confrontation with contradiction too large to comfortably ignore. Other times the disruption is quieter: a sentence in a book, an unexpected conversation, an encounter with another worldview, a moment of emotional overreaction, the realization that one keeps repeating the same pattern despite consciously wanting something different. But whatever form it takes, the experience often carries the same underlying feeling. The map no longer fully explains the territory. This can be profoundly destabilizing. Human beings rely heavily on orienting structures to maintain psychological coherence. Worldviews do not merely organize thought. They organize identity, belonging, morality, expectation, and emotional stability. When foundational assumptions begin weakening, the individual may experience confusion, anxiety, anger, grief, defensiveness, or disorientation long before new understanding fully forms. The mind often resists this process initially. Contradictions are uncomfortable. People generally prefer explanations that preserve continuity over insights that require psychological restructuring. A person may therefore spend years unconsciously defending a worldview long after reality has begun quietly challenging it. But eventually, some experiences become too emotionally or existentially significant to fully explain away. A person raised to believe achievement guarantees fulfillment may discover profound emptiness after success arrives. Someone convinced they are purely rational may notice how often emotion quietly shapes their conclusions. A deeply ideological individual may encounter moral complexity that no longer fits comfortably inside simplified tribal narratives. A person who has always experienced themselves as independent may suddenly recognize how deeply social approval governs their choices. Someone who spent years blaming others may gradually notice recurring patterns that follow them everywhere. At first, these realizations often feel threatening rather than liberating, because awareness destabilizes certainty, and certainty provides emotional shelter. This is one reason human beings frequently avoid self-examination until reality forces it upon them. Reflection becomes more likely when inherited explanations stop functioning adequately. Suffering often accelerates this process, because suffering exposes the limitations of existing maps. The individual can no longer comfortably move through life using assumptions that reality itself has begun contradicting. In some cases, this produces what might be called ontological shock, the unsettling realization that the world, the self, or reality itself may not operate the way one previously assumed. Ontological shock is not merely intellectual. It is emotional, physiological, existential. The nervous system reacts because identity itself becomes destabilized. A person may begin asking, "What else have I misunderstood? Which parts of myself are authentic? Which beliefs were inherited? How much of my identity was socially assembled? What if my certainty was emotional rather than objective? What if I have been unconsciously protecting narratives rather than pursuing truth?" These questions can feel psychologically dangerous because they threaten coherence. And coherence matters enormously to the human mind. This is why awakening processes often unfold unevenly. People rarely abandon old frameworks all at once. More commonly, they oscillate between insight and defense. Moments of clarity alternate with retreats into familiar narratives. The psyche attempts to preserve stability, while simultaneously confronting new awareness. Some individuals eventually deepen into greater reflection. Others retreat aggressively into certainty because uncertainty itself feels intolerable. The same disruption that awakens one person may radicalize another. This depends partly on psychological flexibility, attachment security, identity rigidity, tribe pressure, emotional resilience, and tolerance for ambiguity. Not everyone experiences self-examination as liberation. For some people, increased awareness initially produces grief. Grief for the self they thought they were. Grief for lost certainty. Grief for simplified narratives that once made the world feel emotionally manageable. grief for identities built around assumptions that no longer fully hold. This grief is rarely discussed openly because modern culture often frames awakening as purely empowering. But genuine self-examination frequently involves mourning, mourning illusions, mourning inherited certainty, mourning borrowed identities, mourning the realization that human beings may never achieve the clean objectivity they once imagined possible. And yet something important also emerges through this process: humility. Not performative humility, not intellectual self-erasure, but the gradual recognition that perception itself is more conditioned, emotionally shaped, and narratively filtered than most people initially realize. This realization softens rigid certainty. A person begins noticing how strongly tribe, attachment, identity, emotion, fear, desire, status, and belonging influence human interpretation, including their own. The individual no longer experiences themselves as standing entirely outside the human condition while analyzing it from above. They become implicated. And paradoxically, this implication often deepens compassion. Because once a person recognizes how difficult it is to see clearly through the filters of their own conditioning, it becomes harder to simplistically condemn others for struggling under theirs. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it changes the emotional posture. The examined life becomes less about superiority and more about participation, less about declaring final certainty and more about increasing awareness, less about standing outside the terrain and more about consciously navigating within it. This is why the shock of seeing, though painful, can become psychologically transformative. Not because it delivers perfect truth, but because it interrupts unconsciousness. For perhaps the first time, the individual begins noticing the forces shaping thought while thought itself is occurring. The inherited mind becomes partially visible. The tribe inside the mind becomes partially visible. Emotional narratives become partially visible. Borrowed desire becomes partially visible. The person begins observing not only the world, but the structure through which they are observing the world. And once that process begins fully, it becomes difficult to return completely to the innocence of unexamined certainty.